On the whole, Canada has had very amicable relations with its neighbour to the south, the United States. Apart from if you confuse their accents, then they're not too happy. But did you know that the two have actually been to war with one another? Well, kinda. In this video, I want to talk about 1812, as it was in this year that the aptly named War of 1812 started, which pit the two nations kind of against one another in a way. This video will focus on Canada, and particularly on the role that this war played in the shaping of the Canadian identity, as well as a few other factors. Before getting into that, a quick word from today's video sponsor, which is Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a paid-for video streaming service with thousands of different documentaries that you can gain access to with a small monthly fee. They cover many different topics like science, nature, and history. The idea behind this video was actually inspired by one of the documentaries on Magellan TV. It's part of a series on Canadian history called Canada, the Story of Us, and this episode, the third in the series, is on the War of 1812, which it terms the Canadian War of Independence. And this got me thinking. Of course, we know about the American War of Independence, but what about Canada? And can the War of 1812 be viewed in this light? So it's a really great watch, and you can have access to this and many other documentaries on similar topics by going to Magellan TV. There's even a special offer for viewers of this channel. You can either go to the description or simply type try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert for a free month of premium membership. It's really worth checking out, so do check it out because that does help out the channel as well, and you can get access to all these great documentaries. But anyway, let's dive into it. A little note before getting further into this is that I will be using the Canadian flag and the term Canada throughout this video, but it's important to remember that this flag wasn't adopted until much later, and actually at this point Canada was split into Upper and Lower Canada, and so did not exist as a coherent independent unit. I'm going to give a brief overview of European colonization in the early history of Canada, but if you want to find out more, then please do check out this video where I go into a little bit more detail again. As long-time viewers of the channel will know, the first documented Europeans to reach what is today Canada were the Norse, arriving in the 11th century from their colonies in the North Atlantic, namely Greenland, although you will also know that they didn't stay very long, and so the first new Europeans to come were both the English and earlier also the Portuguese. It must be said, however, that no permanent colonies were established by either of these, largely being only interested in further exploration, as well as the activities of fishermen who could tap into the rich schools of cod that swam there. Instead, it was the French who first started to create colonies in what is now Canada, with already in the earlier 16th century the likes of Jacques Cartier making alliances and trade deals with various native groups, particularly along the St. Lawrence River. Towards the end of the 16th century and going into the 17th, they were increasingly interested in the trade of beaver fur, which they would get from Native American trappers who were used to trapping beavers, who would then trade them to the French at trade posts, and whence they would go to Europe, where they would be turned into extremely luxury, high-value coats and other such items made from the fur. In doing so, the French would trade iron weapons and particularly firearms with those native groups they encountered, which then led to them having a huge advantage over their traditional enemies whom they had been raiding against for centuries most of the time, and so they were displaced, causing a great upheaval among the tribes, especially when the French personally got involved with helping one group against another group. However, they weren't the only ones that were trading with the Native Americans at this point, as other tribes were trading with the likes of the Dutch and the British, who were further south. The Dutch, of course, around New Amsterdam, what's now New York, and the British in other areas as well, who largely traded with other groups which they supplied with iron weapons and with firearms, who could then fight back against those other groups around them that they had been fighting for generations, until they collided with those tribes that the French had supplied, which later became known as the Beaver Wars, as these Native American tribes fought against one another over access to beavers, which they were trading with the European. Eventually, these proxy wars between the British and the French, utilizing their native allies, would come to a full-blown war between the two, and something that will repeat throughout this video is that in Europe, when these nations start to go to war, this would then also impact North America, and it would first start with a proxy war between the native groups. And this eventually led to conflict between Britain and France that spilled over into North America, for example the 9 Years' War, but it ended with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the theatre of war being known as the French and Indian War, when the French handed over all their colonies in what is today Canada to the British. and from this point on, Canada would remain as a British possession. And of course it's because of the French and Indian War and the taxes that were required to pay for it, which would eventually set in motion the events that led to the 1775 American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, as the colonists were unhappy with having to foot the bill. While today we draw a distinction between Canada and the United States, back in 1775 there's nothing to say that the area that is now Canada should not also have revolted together with the other rebels that were mainly based further south, and thus created a single entity. And in actual fact, there were supporters of the American Revolution in what is now Canada during this period, and this is why the American Continental Army, when it was created in 1775, attempted to push into the region of Quebec, which, if you remember, until very recently had been controlled by the French and still contained many French speakers disillusioned with the British. And their hope was that by marching up there, they would rally the support of the Canadiens, as they were called, the French-speaking Canadians, to join their side against the British, and hopefully other English-speaking colonists as well. The campaign into Canada turned out to be an absolute disaster, however, as while they were able to rally some of les Canadiens as well as other English-speaking colonists to their banner, there wasn't as much support as they had hoped, and the attack on Quebec City itself, fought in a snowstorm, was a disaster for the Americans, as they were defeated by the British and by many of the local colonists fighting back against the Americans. And in 1783, when the American Revolution came to an end, Canada remained a part of the British Dominion, while the United States to the south became independent. Not everyone was happy with the new government in the United States, however, as a significant minority of the colonists had supported the British and were hence referred to as Loyalists, and they now found themselves in a country whose morals they didn't agree with, and they'd been on the wrong side, the side that had lost the American Revolution. Many of these would therefore go north of the border, both to escape persecution and to once again be part of the British Empire. For black loyalists as well, within a country that the United States still had slavery, they could earn their freedom by escaping to the north, to the British domain there. So many of them did actually do just that. And this meant that a new wave of loyalists from the new state of America came to Canada and basically ensured that the Canadian population as a whole became more loyalist, as all those from the Americas really went to the north to rejoin with the British. And actually there were so many of them that they had to create whole new towns to house them, like New Brunswick. The Canadian historian Arthur Lower said of the American Revolution with regards to English Canada that it inherited not the benefits but the bitterness of the Revolution. English Canada started its life with as powerful a nostalgic shove backward into the past as the conquest had given to French Canada, two little peoples officially devoted to counter-revolution, to lost causes, to the tawdry ideals of a society of men and masters, and not to the self-reliant freedom alongside of them. In the years following the Revolution, the British from Canada continued to supply the native tribes that had been their allies on the border with the United States, supplying them with both the gunpowder and munitions they needed, as well as firearms, which they used against American citizens. The Americans painted this as the British actively paying these tribes for American scalps, but in actual fact it was the drive of American pioneers and expansionists into these native lands, and actually these tribes were simply trying to protect themselves, as well as traditionally going out and raiding the American frontier, which was much to the annoyance of the American government itself. The American army would fight several wars against these British-backed Native American tribes in the northwest frontier, as the British were trying to create a kind of Native American buffer zone between themselves and the United States. And this would involve the British to varying degrees, but wouldn't come to as large a full-blown war as the American Revolution. However, with the rise in Europe of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, the British and the French would soon be at blows in Europe. Now, of course, the Americans had received aid from the French, who at that time were not yet a republic, but were in the last decades of its own monarchy, and so the Americans felt they had a debt of gratitude to the French. And of course, the French Revolution, that occurred several years after the American Revolution came to its conclusion, also based many of its ideals and were inspired by the American Revolution in turn. And so there was a closeness between these two nations as they had been comrades in arms fighting against the British, as well as the fact that they were trading partners with one another at the time. And this really frustrated the British, who were fighting against Napoleon, and so they demanded that all trade that went through Europe from the Americas had to go through Britain first, and that they should cease all of their trading with the French Republic, who, remember, at this time controlled large areas of Europe as well. They also needed to get as many sailors as they could to fight against Napoleon, as they were attempting to blockade the French in Europe, which required an awful lot of men on their ships, men that they often didn't have, which led to them applying a technique called impressment, where they would force sailors to join the Royal Navy so that they could swell their ranks against the French. This was a big issue for the Americans, as it was said that many American sailors were being pressed into British service, although this was more complicated as well, as many British people tried to pass themselves off as American so that they wouldn't actually have to serve in the Royal Navy. So the story is a little bit more complex. In America, however, there was a lot of deliberation made about this, and there was a party that was very much in favour of going to war with the United Kingdom, and they were called the War Hawks. And it's a combination of these factors that led to the War of 1812. But how does this tie into Canada, and why would this war be considered as a kind of war of independence for the Canadians? Well, remember that so many of the Loyalists from the 13 colonies escaped north to Canada from the United States following the defeat of the British. Well, they really did not want to become a part of the United States. And even before they were there were a lot of Loyalists in Canada, hence the fact that the United States Army was not able to find much support when they had invaded during the Revolution, and why actually many of the Canadian militias were a key instrument of the defeat of the American force that pushed into Canada at the Battle of Quebec. Well, there had been more American immigration to Canada, not just of Loyalists, also of, let's call them, Republicans that pushed north of the border. But these were largely not that political or were disinterested in adding the area to the United States. However, many in the American government wanted to utilize these new immigrants and potentially set up a kind of fifth column, and in that way saw a potential annexation of Canada as a kind of continuation of the American Revolution, of making the whole North American continent part of the United States. And there certainly is evidence for this as well. This would not only incorporate new land into the United States, but it also meant that they would be able to most effectively fight against the British, as the British Royal Navy was at that time the biggest and best in the world, and they didn't have much hope of defeating that force if concentrated on the high seas. However, they would not have to if they could capture Canada, because by capturing Canada they would not only deprive the British of their last major landholdings in North America, they would also take the vast forests of Labrador, which they needed the timber for resupplying and repairing ships in the north. And it would also be a great bargaining chip against the British. If it did come to negotiations, it would leave the Americans with a very strong hand and the British without real means of attacking the Americans. Some of the Warhawks were very much in favour of taking Canada and incorporating it into their empire. For example, Congressman Richard Mentor Johnson said, "I shall never die contented until I see England's expulsion from North America and her territories incorporated into the United States." Although historians have debated to what degree annexation of Canada was a viable proposition for the United States, and actually if that was one of the causes of the war, or whether it later just became a goal or was a side effort. It is true, however, that the British force in Canada was minimal, considering all the soldiers that they needed in Europe at the time. And Thomas Jefferson said, actually, about the situation in Canada, that the acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighbourhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us the experience for the attack on Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent. So a similar kind of vibe as that Mentor had as well, and also this idea that it would be a very easy job because the British forces on the ground were very light indeed, and the Americans had, of course, their whole army stationed to the south, while the British were spread over the entire globe with their colonial holdings. So even if the maritime problems that the United States was having with the United Kingdom were a bigger driver, this idea of annexing what is today Canada into the United States certainly was on the cards and was something that they tried. Writing on this issue, another historian, Reginald Horseman, said, In disagreeing with those interpretations that have simply stressed expansionism and minimized maritime causation, historians have ignored deep-seated American fears for national security, dreams of a continent completely controlled by the Republican United States, and the evidence that many Americans believed that the War of 1812 would be the occasion for the United States to achieve the long-desired annexation of Canada. Thomas Jefferson well summarized American majority opinion about the war to say that the cession of Canada must be a sine qua non at a treaty of peace. When in 1812 war was declared, this meant that the Americans far outnumbered the British in North America. The Americans, as I said, had their whole army obviously on the continent because that's where they were, whereas the British were spread out and fighting against Napoleon in Europe, particularly the Peninsular Campaign in Iberia. They required hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight and, of course, to maintain their garrisons in the United Kingdom to stop a French invasion, so they were massively outnumbered. Therefore, the British in Canada had to rely on the local population, on militias to come and to take up arms to defend the border against the Americans. That is to say, they had to rely on the Canadians themselves to maintain their identity as part of the British Empire. A key figure in the early British war effort was Major General Isaac Brock, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And he was important because he stopped the first American invasion attempt of Upper Canada at the Battle of Queenston Heights, using both militia from what is now Toronto as well as his native Mohawk allies to fight against the larger American force and to successfully drive them back, although he lost his life in the process. As previously stated, he only had command of a few hundred regulars, but the vast majority of his force consisted of Canadian militiamen, of the colonists that were drilled up for service once the war had started, as well as Native American allies. This is interesting, of course, because for the first time, Canadians were defending the land of what is now Canada itself side by side. And in an interesting twist, it were both the Native Americans, or the First Nations as they call them in Canada, as well as those who had chosen to make it their home, rather than the majority being British soldiers from elsewhere in the Empire, largely the United Kingdom. One of the main enemies of the United States and one of the great supporters of the British cause against them was the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. He's perhaps the most famous Native American figure from the war, although there are many of note, and it's his early cooperation with Brock and the friendship that they developed that allowed them to capture Detroit from the Americans early on in the war, and the British had to rely an awful lot on their native allies to make up the numbers and to constantly harass the United States, even though their version of warfare was very different to that of the British. And when Tecumseh was killed in battle at the Battle of the Thames, it was a great loss to their cause. Perhaps the strongest Native American confederacy helping the British during the war were the Six Nations of the Iroquois. They were incredibly important because their warriors assisted the Canadian militia and the British regulars in almost every engagement, as well as harassing the Americans independently with their knowledge of the terrain, and the fear tactics that they inspired in especially the American militia often led to large bodies of Americans surrendering to British soldiers rather than being massacred by their warriors. This, for example, is a painting of the Mohawk, and not actually what you might think is going on in the painting, but they are escorting a Canadian settler, Laura Secord, who was billeted with some British army officers. She ran around 20 miles through the night to warn the British soldiers of an impending ambush, and with this knowledge, the British and a large force of Mohawk warriors were able to defeat the British at the Battle of Beaver Dams, thanks to this information. After being ambushed by the Mohawk, the Americans lost the stomach for a fight, and around 500 of them surrendered to the British forces that were there, and thus they thwarted another attempted invasion of Canada. Later on in the same year, the Battle of Chateauguay was very interesting because the British forces that were being led there were a majority French Canadian and were led by a French-Canadian soldier from a long line of generals that had served the French when they had been in Canada, but had now switched allegiance to the new British, as well as a sizable contingent of, once again, the Mohawk, who were advising them and fighting against the British at this position there. And they, although being outnumbered almost 2-1, were also able to force back the British, and along with another strategic victory against them, would force them to abandon the St. Lawrence River campaign, and thus they'd once again again stopped another invasion of Canada from the United States. Now in 1814, when the war came to an end with the Treaty of Ghent, they had not actually exchanged really much territory at all. There is a tiny bit of exchange with a bit of land going to the United States, but the United States' goal of incorporating Canada did not occur, and Canada remained as a part of the British Empire despite the best efforts of the Americans. Of course, there's a lot more to say about this war, and it was definitely not smooth sailing for the British. They suffered many humiliating defeats at the hands of the Americans, and the Americans made quite a few faux pas as well, so there's an awful lot to say. But this video wants to look specifically at the American attempts to invade Canada, and in this way, because the Canadians were able to stop this from happening, and especially because both French Canadians and English Canadians fought on the same side together against the Americans and for this idea of a Canada that was not dominated by a country to the south and instead was linked to a country that was far away across the sea, that it can be called the Canadian War of Independence in that way. I think for many in the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, it sort of defined what it meant to be part of Canada, what it meant to be Canadian as opposed to what it meant to be American, and that's why so many of them were drilled and called up to fight against the American invasion, that there was this idea of being part of the British Empire as opposed to these Republican ideas, despite the fact that many had come from the Americas. And of course, this is also because there were many Loyalists that had come with them that rejected the idea of the United States and wished to remain a part of the British Empire. It might also for the Americans be called a kind of war of independence. Certainly some of the war hawks called it a second war of independence or a continuation of the war of independence, as they somehow framed it that it might involve the British retaking America and perhaps forcing them into subjugation again, although this seems a lot less likely to have happened rather than the annexation of Canada by the Americans, given British preoccupation in Europe at the time and, well, their failed fumbling attempts to attack New Orleans and others. But for the native people as well, this might be seen as a kind of war of independence, as they were crucial for the British effort, and I think without the allegiance of the Native Americans, it would have been far easier for the United States forces to have invaded Canada and to have defeated the British, because, well, there were an awful lot of Native Americans that fought on the side of the British, and they were subsequently abandoned following the war. And so one might see it as a war of independence. They were fighting against American expansion that was moving into their land, obviously land that the British were trying to create a buffer zone between themselves and the Americans, but it was also a war of survival for many of them, and an awful lot of Native Americans died during the conflict, and some of them continued to fight until 1817, after the peace had been signed in Europe, and they were essentially abandoned by their British allies to be the subject of continual American expansion and invasion of their land. Now, I will point out that tribes like the Iroquois had massively expanded their territory, and that's why I started this video with the Beaver Wars, because the Beaver Wars was a huge period of upheaval for the Native Americans, having been introduced to firearms and then going and capturing land. But at the same time, many of these tribes were pretty much decimated in the period after the War of 1812, not only by disease, but also by continual expansion of the Americans and the fact that the British were no longer helping them to fight back. And really, if the War of 1812 had gone differently, perhaps the Native Americans, even though neither the British nor the Americans can really claim a victory, if anyone was defeated, I think it were the Native Americans who were fighting on the side of the British, which is really rather unfortunate. But that is also where I'm going to leave this video, because I've been talking for quite a while and this video really hasn't been that structured. It's a bit random, but I saw this, as I said, on Magellan TV, this documentary that had called itself the Canadian War of Independence, and that kind of stuck with me, and I thought, yeah, I suppose what would be the Canadian War of Independence? And I think this is probably the best bet. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, whether you would describe this as a Canadian War of Independence. It really is quite different, of course, to the American War of Independence, because Canada, 1, wasn't a country, 2, it didn't change its political status, but it was kind of more of a defensive war of independence, that it retained its connections with Britain and didn't just become another few states in the United States of America. Do let me know, because I really enjoyed researching this topic, if you want a video on, let's say, the Native American side of the War of 1812 and some of the things behind the Beaver Wars, because I personally find that very interesting and would really like to look more into that. But let me know if that sounds interesting. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new, and check out any other videos that I have in the description if you would like to do so. Anyway, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.